So now let's change to biosimilars. This was hugely important. For 5 or more years. We've been talking about whether a, lack of a better word, a generic large molecule drug, but the industry doesn't like to call it generic, a similar large molecule drug like the anti-TNFs or the EPO drugs or many other categories, would be allowed to be made, or would they have to go through their own clinical trials? And so let's just, what recently happened 2 weeks ago, I think it was, when Sandoz was allowed to sell, I guess the brand name now is Zarxio, which is a biosimilar to Amgen's Neupogen. Just explain what happened there. What exactly was allowed?
All right. Well, FDA then approved the first biosimilar drug in the United States.
So that's allowed to be sold now?
Yes, and that was under new provisions that were passed a number of years ago by Congress that opened up a new pathway for getting biological drugs onto the market. And those can be copies, more or less, biosimilars of other biologicals, and so they don't have to submit as much information as you would to do a standalone application for a biological, where you have to do all the toxicology, all the clinical trials, and the whole development program. So,
do we know what the guidelines are now? So if I'm a generic company, or if I'm Teva and I want to make a biosimilar, do we still have a blueprint from the FDA, or are those guidelines pending?
We have a blueprint. We have told companies how we're going to do this, and the advisory committee that we just had for the biosimilar to Neupogen, the committee voted unanimously that biosimilarity had been shown, and therefore recommended to the FDA that—
And that was based on studies Sandoz did on their own product?
Yes, they have to do comparative studies. Whoever is submitting a biosimilar in the U.S. needs to compare it to what we call a reference product, which is the licensed product in the U.S. that they're trying to copy. And so they don't just do their own studies, they have to compare it and show it's similar.
And that raises my next question is, will the branded companies like Amgen be willing to give their information to the company to compare? So will you make it a mandatory sharing process, or how will that work?
Most of the comparisons are physical chemical.
Okay.
So we have published guidance on how to do this. And so basically much of showing of similarity has to do with chemical, biochemical comparisons of the two products. And then on top of that, there's some animal toxicology data, and there may be some clinical data at the top, but it's all comparative.
Okay. So I guess I'm just asking the same question here. We're all interested in what the agency is going to want to see in a package application for a biosimilar. One, they'll need to show chemistry, that the molecules are similar, some animal data. Sounds to me like the biosimilars won't have to do their own human clinical trials, probably.
They would have to do some human clinical data, usually comparative, compare some outcomes to the reference drug. For example, do they have as much immune response or less, or the similar immune response? If there's a good biomarker for the pharmacodynamic action of the drug, then you can just—
like a hematocrit for an EPO drug.
Exactly. Then you can just do that comparison in people. Now, the clinical community wants a lot of comparisons. They like a lot of clinical comparisons. What we have said in our guidance is most of this has to rest on the biochemical and in vitro comparisons. They're not just chemistry tests. They're binding assays, there's cellular assays, or immune assays, things like that.
And what can we expect to see now after the Neupogen biosimilar? Do you have many that are prepared to be approved soon, or can you, this may be not publicly available knowledge, I don't know. So can we expect more of these coming rapidly, or?
We're not allowed to talk about specifics. However, we have a lot of these in development. There are many. We've been very busy, not just deliberating. We've actually been giving a large amount of advice to different companies who are trying to develop biosimilars.
And just changing, and we'll wrap, unless you have something else to say, some of these drugs are overused. The societies, the official oncology societies, have come out and said Neupogen, for example, is overprescribed. This was 2 or 3 years ago, but it seems to have no impact in doctors' behavior. Is there any way the FDA can regulate doctors' prescribing practices, or is that more of a Medicare, CMS issue?
It's traditionally been the responsibility of the boards of medical practice in the states who license physicians. Medicare, of course, has some oversight in certain cases. FDA does not regulate medical practice, but when the FDA Amendments Act was passed, we were given the ability to restrict drugs based on safety problems.
Okay.
So that isn't the efficacy or, quote, overuse, but we now have the REMS program where we restrict drugs.